First Samuel chapter 28 from verses 3 to 19 is one of those passages I am truly grateful that we have in our Bible as a record of an account that when we start reading it, as we will in the next few moments, we will start to realize perhaps a very familiar account that would have reference in a lot of our African cultures. And without holding back in any of your curiosity any further, let's turn to that passage, 1 Samuel chapter 28 from verse 3. You can go all the way to verse 25, but we just want to stop at verse 19 for our purposes. It begins, "Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had lamented for him and buried him in Ramah, in his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land." Let me pause a moment and say there's a reason why this narrative starts this way. It starts by telling us that Samuel had died, and then next thing is telling us Saul had removed the spirit mediums out of the land. It's preparing us for what is about to unfold. So we go to verse 4 and pick up the story. "Then the Philistines gathered together and came and encamped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel together, and they camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid. His heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him either by dreams or by the Urim or by the prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, 'Find me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her.' And his servants said to him, 'In fact, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor.' And so Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes, and he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, 'Please consult a spirit for me, and bring up for me the one I shall name to you.' Then the woman said to him, 'Look, you know what Saul had done, how he has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why then do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die?' Verse 10, "And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, 'As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you, for this thing.' Then the woman said, 'Whom shall I bring up for you?' And he said, 'Bring up Samuel for me.' When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, 'Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul.' And the king said to her, 'Do not be afraid. What did you see?' And the woman said to Saul, 'I saw a spirit ascending out of the earth.' So he said to her, 'What is his form?' And she said, 'An old man is coming up. he is covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel. He stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. In verse 15, now Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I am deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me and does not answer me anymore, neither by the prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you may reveal to me what I should do." Then Samuel said, "Why do you ask me, seeing the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? And the Lord has done for himself as he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also deliver the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." Wow. What a story. I am so grateful that we have this story in the Bible, because it is parallels to some of the narratives that happen in the lives and experiences of most Africans. Things go wrong. We need to find out why things are going wrong. Chances are, if the matter seems like God is not responding, then we need somebody else that we should consult to find answers to why things are going wrong, or why things have happened the way they have. There's a whole lot of background behind the story that we don't really have time to go into. Some of it we'll be able to get into as we go into the story. But what you will realize leading up to this moment is there are a series of problems in Saul's life. This is not really the first time there are issues in his life. In fact, we are really seeing the climax of his downfall, if ever there's an expression like that. So we perhaps need to start off with this point, that Saul's spiritual flaws are pronounced by the death of Samuel and his failure to permanently deal with spirit mediums and spiritists. And you're probably listening to this and saying, that is quite a different take on the reading of this passage. Well, remember, the passage started at a very awkward place. Samuel had died and he had been buried. In fact, that story happens in chapter 25, verse 1. It is simply being revisited at this point because Samuel, as it were, reappears later on in this passage. So the passage is really telling us he was dead. So we know that. It's a fact. Samuel had already died. So we need to realize, again, going back into the narrative, 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 35, and a story had happened where Saul had been instructed to deal with the Amalekites. Remember, the Amalekites were that people group that attacked God's people when they were moving from Egypt into the promised land. In Exodus chapter 17, you will read of this unprovoked attack of God's people by the Amalekites, and Joshua is enlisted to go and deal with them. Now, in chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, Saul is instructed by the Lord to say, look, I need to take my full vengeance on the Amalekites because of that unprovoked attack of God's people way back in Exodus 17. So the instruction is, go wipe them out of the face of the earth. So total annihilation of the Amalekites with the instruction that Saul is given. Now, as you remember in the story, he does not quite follow the instructions. And in fact, he takes matters into his own hands. He lets the king live. He lets the best of whatever the land had to live. The instruction was destroy everything, and he does not comply with those instructions. Now, in the judgment that ensues when Samuel then confronts him and says, so what's going on here? Why have you not obeyed the voice of the Lord? And Saul comes up with an excuse. He says, well, the people wanted to keep some of it. Notice, he does not take ownership and says, I'm sorry, I've sinned. He finds an excuse. In fact, he's revealing his character flaw that you will see consistently in the narratives that ensue, that Saul is not his own man. In fact, he's always influenced by people around him. You will see it in chapter 17 as well. They take a vow about something they need to do. Anyone does not obey this vow, needs to be executed and so forth. And Saul rather changes his mind when he discovers it's his son who was caught up in the compromise. So he was always influenced by others. So when I'm making this point, Saul's spiritual flaws are pronounced by the death of Samuel. In chapter 15, verse 35 of 1 Samuel, when Samuel then pronounces judgment on Saul, is about to leave, Saul grabs him. And Samuel says, God has now torn off his kingdom off you. And the passage ends by stating that Samuel went no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Hear this. Samuel is already displeased with Saul as king. That from chapter 15 onwards, Saul and Samuel never had a face-to-face encounter. So spiritually, from that day onwards, Saul is already in spiritual, splendid isolation, because the only active prophet he had access to is Samuel. And now Samuel is no longer making any contact with Saul. That's the first thing we need to realize. But adding to that, Samuel himself had even died and moved on. So Saul had no opportunity to really ask the prophet, if you like, for advice that he needed. And the second development here is Samuel had removed, Saul had removed from the land the spiritists and mediums. Now, why do I say there's a little bit of a spiritual flaw here in Samuel's life? It sounds like he did something commendable, if you like. I mean, he looked like he was dealing with the spirit mediums. Well, you need to be aware of God's standards as far as spirit mediums and spiritists are concerned. Let me turn with you to Exodus 22, verse 18. The first instruction we come across in the biblical account against this. Verse 27 of Leviticus chapter 20, verse 27, which you want to compare with Exodus 22, verse 18, it says this: a man or a woman who is a medium or has familiar spirits shall surely be put to death. Did you hear that? A man or a woman who is a medium or has familiar spirits shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones, and their blood shall be upon them. That's the divine standard in terms of dealing with spiritists. It means you eradicate them so that there is no opportunity for going back. You permanently get rid of them. What did Saul do? He simply removed them from the land. He allowed them to live. So, as we read the account, in a moment where he faces a real challenge, he knows he can go back because they are there. It's interesting when we read the account, he says, find me a spiritist. What do his people say? Oh, there's one at Endo. How do they know? It's interesting, isn't it? Because if they had been removed from the land and had been permanently dealt with, they could not have come up with a proposal. Oh, we know there's one in Endo. You know what that suggests to me? They were still consulting her. That's how they knew exactly where this woman was. Isn't that a parallel to the realities that we face many times? This idea that, yeah, I've left those things in my past, but they're also within reach. If I need them, I can always go back. That's why I'm making the point. There is a spiritual flaw here. What may look like is highly commendable where Saul removed mediums and spiritists out of the land actually is a problem. Now, some of you may ask, so what are mediums and spiritists? Well, these were individuals who claimed to have the ability to contact the dead, either as intermediaries through whom the dead would speak, or rousing the dead to speak for themselves. Now, in my travels across the continent, I have heard stories of people who will tell me, yeah, no, that happens. You will even hear when the dead speak on their own behalf, the voice is authentic and it sounds like the person they used to know, and so forth and so on. I've heard countless stories of people confirming something like this actually happens. Now, for some of us who have never really had an encounter, we may find this very strange. Is this possible? Well, that's why they're called familiar spirits. It tells you they're very familiar with who they need to contact and what they sound like and how they behaved and so forth, and they can mimic that person. Now, we'll come across scriptures a little later on that explicitly tell us that even the angels of darkness masquerade as angels of light. In other words, one of the uh, epitomes of deceit that the evil one uses is mimicry, is to camouflage. Now, a camouflage means you can't quite see what's going on. Now, we'll talk about that as we go. Now, I want to turn our attention to a parallel passage, perhaps, that will help us see some of these divine standards. And I'm thinking of Deuteronomy here, chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Again, just to hear God's standards. This is what God says. When you come into the land which the Lord God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. Let's stop there for a moment. What is God saying? He is about to take his people into the promised land. The book of Deuteronomy, by the way, is a preparation for the settlement into the promised land. Now, over and over again, God keeps telling his people, survival in the promised land is dependent on your loyalty and faithfulness to my word, to my requirements. So when he's making this statement, do not learn to follow the ways of the nations in those lands. Remember, the promised land was already occupied by Canaanite nations. So they already had their cultural preferences and practices. And God is saying, as my people, how you distinguish yourself is by not learning the practices of those people. So let's bear at the back of our minds that all nations have practices. There are things that they do. Now, these things you will find are mostly in conflict with divine requirements, hence this instruction. Verse 10 says, there shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire, or one who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. Interesting list of prohibitions from God. What is this showing us? Well, these were practices that were common among the Canaanite nations where God's people were about to get into and be in contact with. In fact, you will notice later on that the instruction by God was to drive these nations out. And he even says, don't intermarry with them, because intermarriages would bring and introduce these practices amongst the Israelites as God's people. So he's saying, don't get involved with them. Verse 12, for all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God drives them out from before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. For these nations which you will dispossess listened to soothsayers and diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not appointed such for you. What a statement to really close this little passage that we're reading, Deuteronomy chapter 18, 9 through 14. As for you, God has not appointed that for you. So in other words, as God's people, we can't conform to the standards and practices and patterns of this world. We have to be distinguished by what is peculiar to the instructions, the requirements of God, if you like. So we started by making the point here that Saul is in this splendid spiritual isolation. Why? Samuel the prophet had died. He also had failed to deal with the spirit mediums permanently. He simply moved them to a different location. He did not get rid of them. The second point that we perhaps should make right now as a follow-on to the first one is the fact that an existential challenge exposed Saul's fear and spiritual deficiency by his inability to hear from the Lord. An existential challenge exposed Saul, his fear, his spiritual deficiency, and this is exacerbated by the fact that he was not able to hear from the Lord at all. Now, if we go back into the passage, verse 4 tells us that the Philistines had gathered together and had encamped in Shunem, and Israel also had camped in Gilboa. And verse 5 says, when Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid and trembled greatly. My obvious question is, why? Because if you go back in this entire narrative, since Saul had become king, the Philistines were his hereditary enemy. It's not the first time that he is facing them. So this is an ongoing episode, and every time he had faced the Philistines, he had come victorious, in fact, against the odds. If you go back to chapter 13, you will see he has to fight the Philistines. In fact, what's interesting in most of these encounters is he is very outnumbered. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 5 through 7, Israel had only mustered 3,000 men. And most of them had no weapons. In fact, we're told only Saul and his son Jonathan had weapons. The rest of them didn't really have anything to fight with. Who are they fighting? The Philistines. And what do the Philistines have? 30,000 chariots, plus 6,000 horsemen, plus an innumerable number of soldiers. Well, 3,000 versus 30,000 plus 6,000 plus an innumerable number. Yeah, you could say, yeah, he had a reason to be afraid. Again, in that verse, in that scripture, we're told, yeah, he was afraid because he's completely outnumbered. Get to the end of the story, victory. He's victorious. How is he victorious? Well, the scriptures simply tell us that at the instigation of what Jonathan does, the Philistines are defeated. And how are they defeated? Chapter 14, verse 23, so the Lord saved Israel that day. The Lord saved Israel that day. So what is the pattern in Israel's history of deliverance? Always divine. Always God. So it doesn't matter how many people, armed men, all unarmed men as in this case, they had. God saved his people. Oh man, I almost want to preach here and say it doesn't matter what you have or don't have. When God is on your side, you are in the majority. It doesn't matter how big the threat you're facing is. With God, you are bigger and stronger and greater than any challenge you will face. How come Saul, who had experienced victory after victory where God had fought for him, faces, in fact, the same enemy, the Philistines, and he feels exactly the same way? Fear, great fear, and trembling. Remember chapter 17, 1 Samuel, same enemy. They bring a champion called Goliath. He challenges a whole army of Israel and they flee before him. Now, that's a very interesting account to think about, because the tallest guy in Israel was Saul, who was head and shoulders above everybody else. So the natural match to Goliath should have been Saul, but he also flees for his life amongst everybody else. And a boy, barely a man, young David, comes with a sling and fights Goliath. And then the Philistines are defeated because their champion was taken. Now, Goliath comes with special armory. He even had an armor bearer. He had a spear that it was not easy to lift and so forth. But God defeats him with a simple young man called David. So these stories should be at the back of Saul's mind. He should simply look back and say, every time we faced a challenge, every time the Philistines came to fight us, God showed up in an unprecedented way. That's why we have to make the statement that, well, this challenge simply exposed Saul's fear. Isn't this what the devil uses all the time? Pushes you into a corner where your fear takes the better of you. But you see, when fear is taking the better of you, it's actually exposing your spiritual deficiency. And what is that spiritual deficiency? In more than one ways, it is your inability to hear from God. And in fact, that is what you find consistently pronounced in Saul's life. When you look very closely, he never really had a very successful audience with God. I want to say this today. One of the crises we face today as men and women of God is this very fact: the inability to hear God directly for ourselves. That is one of the greatest spiritual deficiencies. People have no ability to recognize when God speaks. Therefore, when it looks like God is silent, our fear is exaggerated. And our fear is pronounced. Now, I just list these incidences of Saul's impatience in 1 Samuel chapter 13, 5 through 13, when he had to wait for Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice on behalf. Remember, Samuel was a priest as well, and he becomes impatient because people are afraid, and then he goes ahead and offers the sacrifice that he shouldn't have. You also see in chapter 14, he makes this rash decision in verse 24 to 45, where he takes an oath but is not able to sustain it. And you see his insecurity in chapter, his defiance rather, in chapter 15, verses 10 to 31, where again, I mentioned that incident. He's supposed to annihilate the Amalekites and he does not. And then you see his insecurity in 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 16, where the people are giving tribute to David, and Saul has slain his thousands, and David has slain his 10,000s, and then he feels, they're giving honor to this guy and so forth. But literally, he feels insecure because of this young man. He's king, but he's threatened by this young man. And the story goes on and on and on, where you are seeing the spiritual bankruptcy of this man. That pattern already tells us, by the time we get to chapter 28 and verse 6, where he consults the Lord, well, God is not answering him per se. Why? Oh, he really never has actually answered him at all before. So there's a spiritual compromise that simply shows up even at this point where we are reading this account, where he now has a challenge. He desperately needs to hear from the Lord, and God does not show up for him at this point. The other aspect I can also mention here, remember it says there that God did not answer him either through the prophet, that Samuel, or through the Urim, and that's what the priest would have done for him. Now, if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 22, you read of this account in verses 18 to 20, where he is displeased by the priestly family because they'd aided David in his time of need. And then he instructs his own people to now kill all members of the priestly family because he feels they're more loyal to David than they were. Now, the passage tells us that the priests were struck and killed on that day, 85 men who wore the linen ephod, all struck dead, and only one manages to escape. So the question is, when Saul is trying to consult God using the priest, which one was he using? Because he had exterminated the priestly family, if you like. His heart was already against the priests. And as it were, the priest that had survived was now with David at this point. So who was he really consulting at this point? It's like there's nobody really to consult. So God is not speaking directly to him. My point being, if our lives are already compromised, when that moment comes when we need to hear from God, he is not going to speak. Why? Our lives are just not at a point where we can hear God. We are completely unfamiliar with him. In fact, we are already out of fellowship with God, so there's no possibility of him really speaking to us in that father-son relationship that we should have with him. And that's the dilemma Saul is facing at this point. I've often wondered if this is not the crisis most of us face that then drives us into these moments where out of desperation we make wrong decisions because we're just not hearing from God. Well, the follow-on question we can even ask is, do you even hear from God? Have you even heard from God in the past? I want to suggest that is one of the greatest dilemmas we face as God's people. But let me move on and make the third point, that Saul's desperation led him into deeper depravity and insanity. You may ask me, what are you talking about? Well, this man is already on his downfall. But instead of rescuing himself, and by the way, every time he has offended the Lord, he never really confessed. He never really took ownership. In fact, at one stage, he even says to Samuel, well, please honor me before this people. No, he's not interested in really having a relationship with God. He's interested in himself, if you like. So we get to this point where his desperation is now really at its deepest. He needs to hear from somebody. He really needs to hear from the Lord. And God is not saying a thing to him. What does he do? Oh, verse 7. Find me a woman. Why does he not say, find me a spirit medium or a spiritist? Find me a woman. It almost intimates to me he knew there was one somewhere. Because mediums were not just feminine, they could be male as well. But he says, find me a woman. It's almost like he's already suggesting to his people with him who exactly he wants to help with this dilemma. Find me a woman that I may go to her and inquire of her. Now, I am intimating going deeper into depravity and insanity. Well, one of the things we will observe here in this passage when we work through it is, number one, to go to this woman that the servants suddenly suggest, oh, there is one in Endo, which means they knew exactly where she was. Now, if you look at a map, remember we just read that the Israelites were in Gilboa, and then the Philistines were in Shunem. Now, if you look above Shunem, that's where Endo is, going northward. So, for Saul to get to Endo, he had to go past the territory where the Philistines were active. Because Endo is actually on the other side of Shunem. How insane is that? So, he is afraid, but he's not afraid to go past the people that are threatening his life. How insane is that? So when I make the statement that Saul is really digging his trenches, he's digging himself deeper into his depravity, understand what he has to do here. He has to go past the very people that he's afraid of in order to access this woman. The second thing you notice in this passage, looking at his depravity and insanity, he has to disguise himself. Now, if you're a king, you're already a well-known person. Everybody knows who you are. So, Saul had to come up with a very clever plan to disguise himself that nobody could recognize him. You know, the level of hypocrisy here is amazing. This is a man who had tried to get rid of spirit mediums. Now he kind of needs them. Look at the length and breadth that he has to go to try and have access to a spirit medium. And he goes by night. No fear. He goes by night. And as he goes there, he takes only 2 men with him. So he's afraid of the Philistines. He's about to go past their territory they're trying to control, and he only has 2 bodyguards. Somehow he's brave to go past his enemy and consult a spirit medium that he is not worried about a potential threat to his life. He goes, my goodness, look at that insanity that is happening at this time, just to consult a spirit medium. Now, the point I'd like to make here, is this, that sometimes in the name of really trying to do things our way, the mileage we pay is unbelievable. What we end up paying in order to get what we really want, God's way would be a much simpler solution. Look at the things Saul has to do. Simply to consult a spirit medium. And then, verse 9, he finds the woman and he says to the woman, consult a spirit for me and bring up whoever I name. The woman objects. There's almost like a last minute semblance of salvation here for Saul. The woman says to him, well, look, you know what Saul has done. She doesn't even know she's speaking to him. How he has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why then do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die? Even the spiritist knows the standard of God's requirement that this was a death sentence, death penalty, if you like. Now, verse 10 says, Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Who is he swearing by? The very God he's running away from. The very God that's not speaking to him. Somehow he brings him into the picture. No, I swear by God. He does not swear by God at all. But somehow, in the name of convenience, getting what he wants, he calls up the name of the Lord. Exodus 20, verse 7, thou shalt not mention the name of the Lord in vain. Leviticus 19, verse 12, do not bring shame on the name of the Lord your God by using it to swear falsely, I am the Lord. Very strict pronouncements about using the name of the Lord irresponsibly. And Saul, in his depravity, is just sinking deeper and deeper. Verse 11, the woman says then, with a little bit of assurance, who shall I bring up for you? And he says, bring up Samuel. Now, I have to stop there and say, why did he want Samuel? Why did he want Samuel? Well, there's an element he knows, that Samuel was a good man. If he brings up Samuel, and if he's able to come, Samuel might have good things to say to him and help him with the way forward. Remember, he was a godly prophet. He had served Israel. One time he got up before the community and said, is there anyone that have offended? And the whole community was silent. He was a godly man. And he wants him brought up so he can find help from him. And look at that parallel again within our cultures. We always try to find somebody to come and help. So the woman brings up Samuel in verse 12, and she cries out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. Now, I'm not really going to get into the debate here on whether Samuel actually appeared or not. If you want my take on this, I would say, without a doubt in my mind, there is a sense in which I am convinced that Samuel did not make an appearance at this point. Although the woman is surprised and her voice sounds surprised, I think the surprise is probably the recognition that Saul is the one actually having this encounter and so forth with her. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's the fact that somehow, maybe by divine allowance, that Samuel actually appeared. But if you look at the description here, why I think Samuel didn't appear, this is why I would say so. It says, when the woman saw Samuel, I'm not even sure that the woman knew who Samuel was, but if she did, she saw him. It's her description, not necessarily Saul's description here. Because if you read on, he says to the woman, what do you see? She says, I saw a spirit ascending out of the earth. And he says to her, what is his form? So Saul is not seeing any of this as the spiritist only. And then he says there, an old man is coming up, he is covered with a mantle. Then look at this line, and Saul perceived that it was Samuel. Saul perceived, it's like with the description that he has been given, he says, okay, that has to be Samuel. Now, that's where I'm saying I have reservations to come to a conclusive undertaking here to say that Samuel actually made an appearance. I would suggest to you that a familiar spirit made an appearance. Now, I'd like to have that discussion with you if we should take this any further. But that's my take on the passage for now, which makes a lot more sense to me. Why? Well, already we know the dead have no say amongst the living. If that's what God says, and that's what Scripture consistently teaches, then I am more at home with that. So even if Samuel appears at this point, it has to be an exception, but I'm not even willing to run with that at the moment because of what transpires as the passage unfolds. Now, we are just making this point that this man is sinking deeper and deeper into his insanity. Why is this important? Look at the commentary from 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 13 and 14 on this incident, which may help qualify some of the comments I am making. This is what it says. Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord. That's number one. And because he consulted a medium for guidance. That's number two. And he did not inquire of the Lord. That's number three. So when I read this commentary, I'm realizing a man who is already on his downfall. So even this moment is simply showing where his life was at. A man perhaps out of fellowship with God. And then it ends there. And and the Lord, notice, therefore the Lord killed him and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. God himself dealt with Saul. So when I read this, I have to make this one more point, that inquiring from the departed did not in any way assist Saul with his demise, and we have no biblical record that it ever did for anyone else. I don't know if you're getting the point here. So I'm going beyond the argument whether Samuel appeared or not to make the more resolute point to say, even if he did, it did not help. It did not help with the kind of help Saul needed. And neither did it help anybody else. Like you will read Luke chapter 16, that story of Lazarus and the rich man. Lazarus used to eat from the rich man's table, and he was a righteous man, and they both die. And Lazarus went to be comforted by the bosom of Father Abraham, and the rich man was in this place of torment because he was not a good man. And when there's a conversation that takes place there, I think a revelation of heaven, and this rich man says to Father Abraham, please send back Lazarus or somebody to go and warn my brothers who are still on earth. And Father Abraham says, we cannot go back. Even with a good intention, they have Moses, they have God's word. If they don't hear God's word, even if someone were to come back from the dead, it won't help them. That's the point of Leviticus chapter, not Leviticus, rather Luke chapter 16, verses 27 to 31. Now, reading a little further, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 31 has amazing words, very explicit words. It says, regard not them that have familiar spirits, neither seek after wizards. Why? To be defiled by them. At best, that's what they can do. Simply defile you. It's not that they would help in any way. Looking at another scripture, Isaiah chapter 8, verse 19, has this important words for our reflection. It says, and when they shall say unto you, seek unto them that they that have familiar spirits and wizards that peep and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God? No, look at the alternative. The alternative is not seeking after familiar spirits, seeking after these for the living to seek the dead. The scriptures are simply saying this is not on. Why? It just doesn't help you. It just doesn't help you. So let me underscore again 1 Chronicles 10:13, which you read a few minutes ago. It says, Saul died for his transgression which he committed against the Lord, against the word of the Lord, which he did not keep, and also for asking counsel of a familiar spirit. That's what takes Saul. Look, the punishment is imminent. Because we read in the passage that when Samuel speaks, whoever this is, and I'm suggesting a familiar spirit, he doesn't have positive things to say to Saul. He says, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? So why do you ask me, seeing the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? And the Lord has done for himself as he spoke to me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. But you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath. Upon the Amalek, therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you to these days. Moreover, look at verse 19. The Lord will deliver Israel into the hand of the Philistines. Now, in Saul's time, this is the first time they were going to taste defeat. Look at the irony. He consults a medium to get help, and that's the first time he's going to now face defeat. Not only that, it then says, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Well, that's a very dignified way of saying you're going to be dead tomorrow. Does consulting a medium help Saul? No. 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 There's not a single reference in Scripture where it ever helped anybody. And I want to suggest that we really come to an understanding and appreciation of the fact that there are familiar spirits that masquerade as the authentic person that we may consult or need help from. And in most of my research, when I've asked people who have consulted the spirits, they all say the same thing, that they had to do something, but it never really helped. It's like the pronouncements that I hear in some quarters where a person has consulted somebody about a given situation, and the messages they always take away from this consultation is not positive. It actually adds more misery in the context. For example, when you go consult and you're told, oh, it's your brother or it's this one who is doing this to you, well, you are not being given an opportunity to get things right. You are being given an opportunity to make things worse for each other. That's what I find from my research really, really happening. So, how do we close our discussion today? How do we sum up what we are learning? Let me make a few quick points and close this discussion. Number one, spiritual flaws incapacitate us from hearing from God directly and from handling spiritual challenges adequately. Spiritual flaws incapacitate us from hearing from God directly and from handling spiritual challenges adequately. In other words, if our lives are already out of fellowship with God, when we face a challenge, we actually can't face it. Why? We have no capacity to do that. We are already out of fellowship with God. That's why, out of desperate measures, most of us then try to find answers elsewhere. And that is just not the way things work. That's just not the way things work. I also must say, if you like, in the second place, in terms of pointing out this summation, is that existential challenges will always expose your spiritual status, either by bringing out the best in you or the worst in you. Existential challenges will prove where your spiritual standing is. If you're in a good place, then we'll see the best coming out. If you're not in a good place, you may just deteriorate even further. And the third point is, failure to burn bridges, like Saul did. Failure to burn bridges basically means you have a possibility of going back. So what we need to underscore here is, when we want to end our encounters with our past, we have to burn bridges completely, leaving no door for a possible return. When I say I want to follow the Lord and work with Him, then that means I'm completely saying no to the past. Here are a few points to ponder. What I want you to walk away with from the analysis of 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 3 to 19. Well, number one, African cultures and the Bible agree on the belief in life after death, as in the perpetuation of the soul. You will see passages like Hebrews 9:27, as we decreed men to die once and judgment to follow. John 3:16, a very familiar verse. God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish but have everlasting life. So there's that perpetuation of life. You can read chapter 5, 28 through 19 of John, and then John 11, 25, resurrection and the life. Matthew 10, 28. You will just see that the Bible consistently teaches life does not end here, but it carries on thereafter. So our culture and the Bible teach that. Perhaps the difference then is in the actual description of the life after. So we have to make the second point that says the Bible is explicit that the dead or the departed have no say among the living, and therefore prohibits consulting them. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 verse 7 will show us that, when your life on earth is done, it is done. But you carry on in the afterlife. Your soul carries on, but there is no opportunity for you to come back. That's very consistent. You can even look at Psalm 115 verse 17 and 18, Revelation chapter 14 verse 18, and Isaiah 57 1 and 2. You will see this consistent teaching that once we move on from this life to the next, we have moved on. Now, in making these statements, I would like us to realize then that when our loved ones pass on to the next, it is not the kind of funeral we give them that truly honors them, but following in their godly footsteps. So it's not the extravagant funeral that says, now I'm honoring them because we're thinking of their participation, continued participation in our lives. No, it's actually if they were godly. That's why you have this phrase in the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's more their line and walk with God that is still being celebrated and remembered. It's not that Jacob is coming back or Abraham is coming back or anybody for that matter. It's more the memory of their walking with the Lord that's being celebrated at this point. So you will see consistently the Apostle Paul will teach, that follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Hebrews 13 verse 7, remember those who brought the word of God, mark their lifestyle so that you can also emulate or follow their example. So it's more important to be convinced about a godly lifestyle and emulate that than really to just now have this grand, lavish funeral, to celebrate someone's life. No, we need to celebrate the God that they followed by living according to the same God's requirements and standards. That, if you ask me, is the kind of funeral I would like to have. Remember, I won't even be there. So if people want to honor my life, personally, I wouldn't want a lavish funeral. In fact, if you have any contributions to make, rather give them to those who are still on earth, who are still living, and who have still life ahead of them. And please, the simplest of coffins, if anything. In fact, I don't even think it's necessary. And a very simple grave, if you want. But this lavish going out of the way is perhaps more for us. It has nothing to do with the deceased. The last point really being, God remains the only one we can consult at any given point when we face challenges in this life. God is the only one we can consult. We don't need to consult a witch doctor. We don't need to consult the dead. In fact, they have no say among the living. We don't have to consult anybody. Scriptures are very explicit. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge God, and He will make your path straight. That is important to hear. If there are words I could steal from someone else's mouth and make them my own, it would be the words of Dr. Billy Graham, who's gone home to be with the Lord. He says, someday you will read and hear that Billy Graham is dead. Don't you believe a word of it. I shall be more alive than I am now. I would just have changed my address. I'll have gone into the presence of the Lord. Man, if we are going to be at a better place when God takes us home, I think the message we need to really resonate with is, may we make sure as many as possible follow suit. So we end with 1 Corinthians 15:54. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? God bless you.